Today's topic is radical equations. Our objective for today is to solve radical equations and identify extraneous solutions. We demonstrate on the exit ticket, the quiz, and then the unit test at the end. All right, we have kind of three levels that we're going to go over. Level one is kind of our basic problem. We just have a radical. We'll do a little bit of math with it. Level two, we're adding in an exponent. So we're going to have like a 2/3 power or 3 and a 5. So we have some type of exponent in there. And then we have a level three problem where we add in an extra x, all right, or an extra variable like this m. We'll see what that does to our problem. Each one kind of gives us a different type of answer. It's not too much different. Yeah. Hopefully you're noticing if you're reading through, all the steps are pretty much the same. They're just worded a little bit different. And then, yeah, got it. The bottom, like usual, we have our you do problems, level one, level two, level three. I want to remind everybody to try and do those and send me those to get checked off before you start your exit ticket. Because some of you are starting your exit ticket early, getting a bad grade on the exit ticket. You're wondering why your grade's dropping. Probably because of that. Double check to know you know what you're doing before you actually do the work that is graded. All right. Go back up to the top. Level one. Our steps are as follows. Get the radical on one side and everything else on the other. Raise each side to the opposite of the root. Simplify, and then check your solution. Usually when we check our solution, it's kind of a quick check. This one's going to be very important because there will be a lot of extraneous solutions in these problems. All right, it's going to be very important that you actually check your solution every time. Like I will say, in these 6 problems that we're going to go over, 3 of them will have extraneous solutions. All right, so make sure you're doing that. Let's go through our steps. For the first one right here, we need to get the radical on one side. So I need to get this square root on one side, and I need to get rid of everything else. So I need to get rid of this positive 3. To do that, I'll subtract 3 from both sides. I'll get square root of 2x minus 3 equals 5. 8 minus 3 is 5. Right? After that, now that we just finished up this one, we can stamp it off. Check mark, we're done with that one. Now we're going to raise each side to the opposite of the root. So currently, we have a square root right here. So we're going to raise each thing to the squared power. Like so. So again, since it's a square root, I raise each thing to the squared power. I'm going to simplify. The square and the square cancel out. I end up with 2x minus 3 on this left side. And then 5 squared gives me 25. All right. So now we just finished up with the raise each side to the power. And now we just got to do that little bit of simplifying. All right. Pretty easy problem. We learned how to do this in Algebra 1 and everything. Move the 3 over, divide by 2. We end up with x equals 14 at the end. That's our simplify steps. We just finished off that step. And we just have one last step to do. Check our solution. All right, so with our check our solution problem, all we're going to do is we're going to plug in this 14 to our original equation. We're going to see if it works out. All right. So we plug it in, simplify. 2 times 14 gives me 28. 28 minus 3 gives me 25. Square root of 25 is 5. 3 plus 5 is 8. And since those two match, since 8 equals 8, x equals 14 does work as my answer. All right, so this would be a correct answer, x equals 14. Are there any questions on level 1, the first problem of level 1, before we move on to the second problem for level 1? Anybody confused on anything? Want me to re-go over anything? Anything like that? All right then. Move on to number 2. Let me know if you have any questions. We can always go back to it. I'm going to follow this same process. Get the radical on one side and everything else on the other. So I'm going to subtract 5 from both sides. So I get square root of x plus 3 equals -1. Now I'm going to do the same process I did before. Just checked off this box right here. Erase that so we can go back over it. Just finish up step 1 by itself. Step 2 is to square both sides. Squared this one, squared this one. I end up with x minus 3 equals 1 on this right side. Now that that's all done, we finished up this step. All done. Last step, do some simplifying. X equals -2. Step 3 done. Now again, the last step is to check my solution. Means I need to plug it back in. Right? Plug it back in. -2 plus 3 gives me 1. Square root of 1 is 1. 1 plus 5 is 6. 6 does not equal 4. So, since the sides don't match, there is no solution because this does not work. Since it did not equal the same thing on both sides right here, since this did not match, this does not work. We end up with no solution. Right? That's why we should always check our solutions, because sometimes we'll get an answer that doesn't end up working. It's a very common thing to happen with these. Are there any questions on that? Anybody have any questions on level 1? Any part of this? Anybody want me to repeat anything? Anything at all? Let's move on to level 2 then. See any questions coming in? We'll only wait so long. Level 2. Very similar. The only difference with our steps is instead of just raising it to a certain opposite power, we're going to raise it to the reciprocal. Hopefully you remember the reciprocal is the fraction flipped upside down. All right, so instead of a 2/3, I'm going to be raising each thing to the 3/2 power. But first, before that, we need to get the radical on one side and everything else on the other. All right, so I need to get rid of this 3 right here. Do that, I divide both sides by 3, and I end up with n plus 1 to the 2/3 power equals 4. So that was my first step. Just finish up here. Check mark, check mark. Now move on to the second step. Raise each side to the reciprocal. So instead of the 2/3, I'm going to raise each side to the 3/2. 3/2, 3/2. Do some simplifying. I get n plus 1 equals plus or minus 8. All right, so that was this step right here. Now we got to do the simplifying. I want to talk about how I got plus or minus 8 in the end. It's the same thing we did with our warm-up, where we technically, whenever we have a squared term, like we have technically n plus 1 squared right here, equals some number. Let's just put a number sign. All right. When I square root this to get rid of it, I always have to remember that I have to add the plus or minus out front. Right? I always have to do that, so I have to do it the same thing when I ever have an even power up here. So whenever this is even exponent, add plus minus. All right, so whenever I have that even exponent up top, you're going to need to add that plus or minus. Since this one is odd, I don't need to. No. And so let's go over how I got 8 now. So now that we know that it's a plus minus from that, from the fact that this is it, let's go through how to get 4 to the 3 halves power into 8. So I can rewrite 4 to the 3 halves as the square root of 4 to the 3rd power. Right? The square root of 4 right here is 2 to the 3rd power. But whenever I square root a square, I have to add that plus or minus out front. Plus, minus. Then I cube it. All right. Positive 2 cubed gives me 8. And then negative 2 cubed gives me negative 8. So I get plus or minus 8 in the end. That's kind of what we can do for every one of these. All right. I can rewrite it as a square root, a cube root, whatever it happens to be, to whatever powers up top, like the 3 up here. Do that square root or cube root first, then square or cube it. Okay. The process we're going to do. So again, all I can need to do, change it back into the other form, and I can do that simplifying real easy. I got to be able to switch between forms pretty easily. Are there any questions on how we did this part, getting the plus or minus 8, before we move on to finishing up the simplify and our check solution? Yeah, I can show it again. Let's erase it. We'll go back over it. So again, I rewrite this part right here, right over here, the 4 to the 3 halves power. Whenever I have a divided by in my square root, I can rewrite it as a index out front. So I can rewrite it as the square root of my 4, and then I still have my 3rd power, so I leave that up top. The square root of 4 is a nice whole number, being 2 to the 3rd power. All right, but whenever I square root a square like this, to do this trick, I always have to add my plus or minus out front. It's one of our rules that we learned back in the first semester. Hopefully we're starting to remember it. Now we cube both of these. This is equal to 2 cubed or negative 2 cubed. I wanted to rewrite this to kind of show it more by hand. 2 cubed is 8. Negative 2 cubed is negative 8. So that's how I get that plus or minus 8. Are there any more questions on that before I move on? So we'll move on. Subtract 1 from both of these. 8 minus 1 is 7, and negative 8 minus 1 is negative 9. 7 or negative 9 are my two answers right here. Now I have to do the process of checking my answer by plugging it in. I plug in my 7 first because it's my first number. 7 plus 1 is 8. 8 to the 2/3 power is 4. 3 times 4 is 12. So that is my correct answer. So this one right here, this 7, checks off. Both of these match. Now I tried the next one. Plug in my negative 9. Simplify to be negative 8. Negative 8 to the 2/3 equals 3 times 4 equals 12. 12 does equal 12. That checks off right here. So this one also works. All right. Again, have to check your solutions. Are there any questions on the first level 2 problem before we move on to the second level 2 problem? Anybody have any confusion on it? Are you confused about any part? Want me to go over it? Anything at all? Let's go over the second one then. Same process, get everything over on the same side. Subtract 1, divide by 3. Morning. So whatever you want. I'm going to then rewrite the 3 and the 5 as 3/5 power. You can go back and forth between the two. Then I'm going to raise it to the reciprocal. So the opposite of 3/5 is 5/3. 5/3, 5/3, both sides. Do a little bit of simplifying. I get x equals 31 in the end. All right, let's go over how I got 32 from this right here. Same process we did before. 8 to the 5/3 can be rewritten as the cube root of 8 to the 5th power. All right, the cube root of 8 is a nice 2 in the end. So I get 2 to the 5th power. So I got this right here. 2 to the 5th is 32. Again, I rewrote that fraction right there as a cube root. Then I simplify. All right. And my last step is I need to plug in and check if I got the right answer, if it does work out. Before I do that, are there any questions on this so far before we start in? They plug it in. Do some simplifying. The fifth root of 32 is 2. 2 to the third is 8. 3 times 8 is 24. 24 plus 1 is 25. Since these two match, it does work out. Check mark, check mark. And so 31 is one of my answers. I want to repeat to everybody about this exponent thing because I noticed that a lot of people last class in my yesterday's classes didn't remember this. If this is an even exponent, I add that plus or minus. Since this is an odd exponent, since this is a 3, I do not add that plus or minus. Something that I see a lot of people make that mistake on. Are there any questions on this? Anything at all? Do you need me to repeat anything? Go back over it? Anything at all? All right, I'll give everybody a little bit of time to write this down if they haven't already. You know, those extra things I might have written down on my screen. All right, let's move into our last section, the level 3 problems. This one is where we had the extra x or the extra m, whatever the extra variable is. And this is actually going to make it a squared problem. Right? So first thing's the same. I need to get my radical on the other side. Once radical on one side, everything else on the other. So I need to move this 5 over. So I get this right here. Now, just like we did before, we're going to raise each one to the opposite power, which is the squared power. Opposite here, right here and here. When I simplify this, this just becomes x plus 7 on this left side. This becomes x squared plus 10x plus 25. Again, to do this right here, I FOILed x plus 5 times x plus 5. FOIL, FOIL. First, outside, inside, last. Give you this one simplify. So far, do a little checklist. You got them by themselves. We raise each side to the opposite power. And now we just need to simplify and check. All right. To simplify, I need to move everything over to one side. So I subtract my x, subtract my 7. Get x squared plus 9x plus 18 equals 0. Rewrite this as x plus 3 times x plus 6 equals 0. And then finally, x equals -3 or -6. My answer. Before we do our check and see if our answers are correct or not, does anybody have any questions? This part right here? All right, so with this part right here, I moved everything over, subtracted x, subtracted 7. Then I factored this using my X method. All right, two numbers that multiply together to get 18 and add to be 9 are 6 and 3. 6 times 3 does equal 18. 6 plus 3 does equal 9. So I use 3 and 6, right like this. Put those in here and then simplify. Because I can set each one equal to 0 and go x plus 3 equals 0. Or x plus 6 equals 0. So x equals -3 or -6. Any other questions? Right. So let's move on to the next part where I plug it back in. First thing I do is I plug in my -3. -3 plus 7 gives me 4. Square root of 4 is 2. 2 minus 5 is -3. Since those two match right there, this first one is a solution. The second one, right here, when I plug it in, -6 plus 7 gives me 1. Square root of 1 is 1. 1 minus 5 is -4. Since those two do not match, -6 is not a solution. And so my only solution will be x equals -3 in the end. Check. Check. That's a good reason to always check, especially with these extra x ones. This second problem, one of these two will almost always be wrong. There's some special cases where you can make it both be right, but whenever you have two of these, most likely one of these will be an extraneous solution. One of these won't work out. Right? Are there any questions on first problem of level 3 before we move into the second problem? Someone asked a great question in the chat. On a test where we only submit the correct solution and not the both we get, that's correct. You would say that just x equals -3 would be your solution. The problem might ask, like, state your solution as the correct solution and the extraneous solution. So you would say x equals -3 is a solution, and x equals -6 is an extraneous solution. Right? But more than likely, like on your exit ticket today, you will see just one of them. All right, the multiple choice, you gotta tell me which one is the correct one. All right. Any other questions before we move on to the second problem? For the second one, very similar. Since the radicals are already by themselves, I'm going to square both sides. Once I've squared both sides, the first set of square roots will go away. End up with this at the start. Right. Once I've done that with that simplifying part, I'm going to do the same exact thing we did again, raise each side to the same power again. whole thing. And then we end up with two m plus 5 on the left side, and then m squared plus 2m plus 1 on the right side. Right? Now, just like we did before, we need to get everything on one side, do all that stuff. M squared minus 4 equals 0. Plus or minus 2. 2 or negative 2. Let's go through our check marks and make sure that we understand where we got all this from. This first step, I got my radical by itself. That one's already done for us. It never was separate. I'm going to raise each side to the opposite power. We do that right here. Then we actually do that a second time right here. We actually do the raise the power twice. Then we did our simplify right through here. We have our answer so far right here. The last thing we need to do, like usual, is to check our solution. We need to plug this back in. Plug in my 2. 2 times 2 gives me 4. Square root of 9 is 3. Square root of 3 is the square root of 3. Those two match. Since they match, m equals 2 is the correct solution. So we'll try the other one now. Plug it in again. Do some simplifying. Final answer of this one right here. Since these don't match, only one of these was the correct solution, and negative 2 did not work. Because 1 does not equal the square root of negative 1. So that's our answer right there. Are there any questions on level 3 before I set you loose to work on the you-do problems and then the exit ticket at the end? Anybody have any questions? Yep. They haven't given me anything, so no. You do have to leave your phone and everything. All right. If there doesn't seem to be any questions, you can all start on the you-do problems. I'll leave this on the screen so you can, write it down if you would like, all that good stuff.